Welcome to another episode of Podcasting in Professional Services. Today, I'm joined by Angela Mazzi, an architect and career coach. Angela is dedicated to enhancing quality of life through the built environment with an emphasis on sociocultural impacts. Angela is a principal and senior medical planner at GBBN Architects and also the host of Architecting, a weekly podcast about the architect as a person. Angela, welcome to the show.
Thanks, John. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited for our conversation today. I was listening to a few episodes of your show, and I like the focus on the architecture as a person instead of as just a career, because you're more than just your job title, and I think you do a good job at touching on that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something I realized, this idea that how you do anything is how you do everything. And when we don't take care of ourselves, we actually short circuit the creative process. So we think that, driving ourselves really hard makes us better or more productive, but it's actually the opposite.
Well, I'm excited to dive into your podcast and what it's all about and kind of why you started it and your whole journey. But before we do that, can you tell me a little bit about GBBN? What kind of architectural challenges do you solve for clients?
Sure. So we are what's called a mid-size firm. We have 5 offices. So we are in Pittsburgh. Our main office is in Cincinnati. We're in Louisville, Minneapolis, and Beijing, China. But because of our size, we're able to be a lot more innovative and nurturing as a practice. We're not so big that we are, held back by a lot of bureaucracy or process. And we're very, very invested in doing good work that empowers people. And that's true in all of our markets. So we work in healthcare, which is where I am focused, but we also have community development, corporate workplace, higher education, and arts and education. So we do a pretty good variety of work, and all of it really focuses on an audience and a user group that we can work to empower. So we have a lot of fun doing that. I think we have a great culture. I've worked quite a few places before I landed at GBBN, and I really love the climate of the firm and the fact that they never say no. They're very much a yes and kind of a place, and I'm excited, being a partner now, having that leadership and getting to perpetuate that culture.
That's very cool. And you mentioned empowering the profession, empowering architects. Now, you're both an architect and a career coach. I'm curious, Angela, have you found it challenging to balance both of those without losing focus on one or the other?
Actually, not really. So what got me into the career coaching was more just that I found a lot of times people would come to me with their problems or their issues. And what I started to notice with friends and colleagues, people who had changed jobs, is that the issues were kind of universal and that it didn't seem to matter when they changed firms. They would eventually, after a honeymoon period, run into the same issues. And what I started to notice is it's not really where you are, it's you. And you could work at the best firm in the world, but if you're not clear on what you want for your career, you may end up doing work that you don't love. You could work somewhere that's toxic, but if you're not clear, you could get gaslit into believing that you don't have other options. So being really clear on why you're doing this and being your own advocate is important no matter what. And I started to realize that I could help people reconnect with that. I think a lot of the time we go to school and we're really idealistic and we graduate and we hit a wall. And the truth is, architecture is a really tough profession. It's hard to get accepted into a program, even harder to graduate. 2/3 of the people never do graduate even. And then you have to work to get licensed. So these are more years you're putting in before you're actually an architect. It's also a business. Unlike other forms of art, you gotta have clients and you've gotta serve those clients.
That's right.
So it's very easy in the profession to kind of get steamrollered into just everything it takes to do a project and do it well, and lose sight of the why. So I wanted to help people reconnect with that, because when we lose sight of that, I think we can fall prey to consumerism, and that's not really serving our clients. And I think it also takes a toll on us, causes more burnout because we're not excited and it doesn't seem meaningful to do what we're doing. So I think to the extent that I can help anyone light that fire and keep it burning, that it is a critical thing that our profession needs.
That's really cool how you were able to identify those different patterns that emerge from people who are, you're talking to, you're having conversations with these different people, and you're noticing these patterns that have popped up, and that's led to a career path for you where you can help other architects out there in the profession. Now, Angela, what I'd love to do is I'd love to dig into your architecting podcast. And this podcast launched in 2021. Again, you don't really talk about buildings. Instead, you help overwhelmed and burned out architects reclaim their passion for great design. And you've got conversations around topics like introversion, expertise versus experience, delegation, stress management, all of the things that go into the architect as a person. Why launch a podcast? Why that format?
Well, it didn't start out that way. So in 2010, I started a blog, and it was called The Patron Saint of Architecture, and it kind of came to me like a download one day in the shower, like all the best ideas do, and was just, there has to be a better way. At the time, I was working in a very toxic firm. I was feeling like we were often pleasing the client to the detriment of the project when there needs to be a better balance, and just feeling kind of discouraged. And at first, when I started it, I would take ideas that had been plaguing me, like, why are we saying yes when we know that's not the right thing to do? Or when we know that this isn't going to be a durable long-term solution or perform, why are we saying yes? And what I found in writing about it, because I knew it wasn't my diary, it was a blog, I couldn't just name names and slam people and complain. So it forced me to kind of think about what was troubling me, and not to get stuck complaining, which I think most of us do. We love to gripe, and instead be solution oriented. So I would always try to explore the issue and then think about what you could do differently. I did that through about 2016, and then kind of stopped for a while, and then working with a career coach myself, it was suggested that I do a podcast and that I rebrand it. And so that's where I came up with the idea of architecting. So it's a verb. It's a action oriented kind of a movement. And the reason a podcast is podcasts are more available. So a blog, if you don't know it's there, you don't know it's there. Whereas a podcast can be available on any platform. So anywhere you like to listen to podcasts, you can find architecting. So it's just a better way to reach more people. And also, a lot of us are on the go, and it's easier to listen to something while we do something else than it is to have to stop and read and focus.
Well, that's one of the biggest appeals of podcasts to me personally. You don't need your eyes, right? You can listen to it while you're driving. You can listen to it while you're walking the dog or exercising or doing dishes or folding laundry. So yeah, that's definitely a big appeal. And I think more and more businesses are catching on to that and using a podcast as not only a channel to reach people on those different parts in their day, but also as a source of content that you can use for video, and you can turn the transcripts into blogs and things like that. So, Angela, what I want, when you started your podcast, you were working full-time as a healthcare architect, and you made partner in your firm, and you're on the board of 2 organizations. You're a single mom. One of the biggest objections I hear from folks is that they just don't have enough time to launch a podcast. How did you handle all of that comes with a podcast without burning out, without making compromises, without letting the podcast itself fizzle out?
Well, I've always said I'm too busy is code for that's not my priority.
Yeah.
And I wrote a whole book called Time Builder that deals with this topic specifically because if you actually look at how you spend your day, you'd find that there's a lot of time you're spending that isn't getting you anywhere, right? It is just time binge watching something or doom scrolling social media or just kind of, wasting time versus doing things that are purposeful. Now, I'm not ever going to say that we don't need rest, but I do think that when we do things we love, it energizes us. And when we are energized, we're inspired, and we can do more, better in less time. So, while it does feel like I have a lot on my plate, I only say yes to the things that really excite me. Therefore, I can bring more to it, but also I look for the convergences. So these things might seem really different from one another, but to me, there's a connection. And what I learn doing one thing helps me do something else. So they kind of work together and they're not separate things. I did an episode recently about decompartmentalizing your life. Because if you do put your life into silos and you are one person at work and one person with your family and another person with your friends and so on and so forth, there's a certain minimum amount of energy that has to sustain any one of those silos, and it actually takes away from your overall energy. But when you can overlap them, then you can start to free up more energy so you can do more things without it being so exhausting. And that's really how I do it. I kind of wake up every day and say, be brilliant. Because I think when we tell ourselves we can do something, when we say, how can I? Instead of thinking of all the reasons we can't, we actually leverage our brain for how it was designed, which is to solve a problem. So when we say, how can I? We figure it out. I call my audience bright lights because I really do believe that there are no extra people in the world. We all have a purpose. And if I were to ask you, what's your dream? And I were to ask 20 other people, you would not say the same thing. Everyone would have a different answer. So the things that you feel called to, you're meant to do. So it is absolutely your filter through which you pursue the career. So it might be part of what you choose to do, but also how you choose to do it. My career as an architect isn't going to look like somebody else's career as an architect because of my unique passions and interests and the other things in my life that I'm converging on that.
I'm reminded of a quote from Henry Ford, I believe, who said, whether you think you can or whether you think you can't, you're right. I see you nodding your head, Angela.
I tell my kids that all the time.
And it's funny, I was just interviewing Randy Crabtree from Tri-Merit, which is a specialty accounting and tax firm, and he was telling me about a book called Find Your And it's all about who you are outside of work is more important than your career and your job title. And those are the people that you are working with. You're not working with Jane the accountant, you're working with Jane the mom. So I think that that's another really important part about business, and especially in professional services where things can be so technical and academic and rigid.
Understanding who people are and what they care about and what they need and how they communicate really does impact how well you can reach them. And we gotta meet people where they are. We gotta look at it as every day is our starting line. It doesn't matter what you've accomplished. It matters what you are doing right now in this situation. And I think a lot of times, and this is a challenge, I deal with it every day myself, so I'm not perfect at this, but to get your ego out of it. So much of our time is spent worrying about how we look or whether we're being seen or heard. And instead, if we can take our ego out of it, think more about what are we trying to accomplish in this meeting or with this project or whatever the situation is. Now it's not about us anymore. It's about the bigger picture. And I think we can get buy-in from everyone that we are working with on that big picture and how it matters. So if we see that something is maybe going off the reservation, instead of saying, what are you doing, or thinking that you're being attacked or not respected or whatever that is, simply redirecting and asking the question, how would this serve this bigger goal, can help people stay focused and on track and keep everybody co-creating in a very generative way, and creates that psychological safety that's really important.
Totally. And I like to think about it as understanding the other person, your counterpart, and being interested rather than interesting, maybe, is another way to kind of frame that too, where it's important to understand where your counterparts, your colleagues are coming from, so that you can approach solving problems from a place of empathy and understanding. Well, Angela, going back to your podcast, at the time of this recording, the Architecting Podcast has published over 230 episodes. So that is quite impressive. To deliver on a weekly cadence like that, you must have a solid production workflow. What does that look like? Can you take us behind the scenes? How are you able to deliver on episodes like that each week?
Well, I love that you asked that, because I am a very spontaneous person. I'm not a planner, which is maybe kind of counterintuitive because my title is medical planner, but I hate planning. I love being intuitive. I love feeling into things. So about 20% of the episodes are interviews, which those are scheduled ahead of time. The others I do as solo casts, and much of the time I sit down and I say, what do I feel like talking about? And it may be a recent experience that made an impression, either good or bad, on me. It might be an article that I wrote. It might be a suggestion that came in from the audience. And at first, I took a podcast class before launching the podcast, and it was recommended that you have an outline for your episode. So I did that, and especially that first episode, I felt so much pressure because I needed to set the scene and really, tell you what this podcast was about and show you who I was. And it was all written, right? And now I literally just talk. And what I've noticed, just a little tip with podcasting, is never hit stop. Just talk. Because you can always edit it later. And if you stop, you lose the flow of your thinking. So I really do just get on there and talk. And I shoot for about 20 to 30 minute episodes because I find that's about the length of time most people care to listen. Longer, they tend to drop off if you look at the listen rates. So I do the episodes about that length of time, and I've done it enough now that I have a sense of how long that really is to talk. And I will say it takes twice as long to edit as it does to record, sometimes more, because you got to keep listening and going back and filtering and maybe taking something out or saying, oh, I wanted to link those 2 points, so then you go record another sentence and stick it in the middle. But that's really been my process, and I know a lot of people will outsource editing. I couldn't imagine doing that because I don't know how somebody else would know what I really want to get across, so I love doing my own editing.
That's what I've found too, especially in professional services, is the subject matter. You really need to understand it in order to be able to know what are the key points, not only just for editing, but for pulling out little video snippets to share on social media. That's something that really takes an understanding of the subject matter. Angela, you've been running the show for a few years now. It must be having an impact on the business. Can you share how your podcast fits into your overall business and marketing strategy?
Sure. So for me, it all started with recognizing, and I'm going to go back to like being a very young child, that space felt like something. And I loved, climbing on top of the refrigerator and noticing the kitchen felt like a different place, or looking at things from under the coffee table in the living room. And eventually that led me to be an architect. But in school, part of what I really loved studying wasn't so much the technical stuff, but the cultural parts of it. So I have a minor in architectural history and a minor in organizational behavior. Also in graduate school, I studied social and cultural links because I had a bachelor's in architecture, which is a professional degree. I didn't have any academic requirements for my master's degree, so it was a wonderfully freeing and clarifying time because I took sociology and psychology and, just really had a great time exploring how space impacts behavior, and through that well-being, continue to do that in my career, and eventually stumbled upon a term called salutogenesis, which was coined by a medical anthropologist named Aaron Antonovsky, and it's Latin for health generating. When I studied what he was really talking about, I'm like, that's it, that's everything I've always been doing. This is what I care about. And the core of salutogenesis is resources to cope. And the more I studied it, it also has a lot to do with stress, and how stress, whether it's external things in our environment or social or economic issues, takes away our resources. And when I think about career paths, it also comes down to stress, and it also comes down to resources to cope. I offer a program called Salutogenesis for Your Soul, and I talk a little bit more and dig into that more with people, and we do things like breath work and other kinds of techniques, but everything I do is really predicated on this idea of giving people resources. And my signature course I offer is called Stressless Success, and this idea that we can define success on our own terms, not based on how somebody else thinks it should look, and that we need to bring in, like I was saying earlier, our clarity, our passion, our convergence of our interests, and in doing that, we're going to express ourselves best. And to me, it's really important that I do work full-time. I am a practicing architect, so I'm not just giving you advice because it sounds good.
Right.
Everything I talk about, I've experienced, I've done in my own life. So I have, the money where my mouth is, if you will, or the experience behind it. I know what didn't work for me. I know what has worked. I've learned some painful lessons, so you don't have to. And that's really how I kind of blend the two, is While it may not seem to be connected on the surface, for me, it's really all about the same thing.
That's so the focus is more on elevating the profession, and it's more about giving back to the community. Very good, very good. Well, speaking of giving back, Angela, you mentioned that you'd like to touch on the systemic codependency that persists in the AEC industry. Can you expand upon that point? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so codependency, aka people pleasing, a lot of people don't think they're codependent because they think people who are codependent are not able to do anything without somebody else assisting them, or they view it as hopelessness and they think, well, that's not me. Well, that's not true. Codependency is actually rooted in your need to make other people happy at the expense of your own well-being. So when you think about it that way, the light bulbs go off and you're like, oh, we're taught from when we are in school that because it's a creative profession, there's no right answer, so it can't be easy. We've got to pull all-nighters. The first idea you have could never be good enough. You have to keep doubting yourself. You have to keep overproducing. You have to compete. And as we get out into the profession, of course, we practice that way too. And you see it in fee wars, which benefit nobody. If you've heard about the economic theory of blue ocean versus red ocean strategy, it becomes a red ocean, and that doesn't serve our profession. It actually hurts our value in the world. So things that this can look like is needing to be in control, being a perfectionist, suppressing your emotions because you don't want to look weak or vulnerable, losing your own identity and sense of what you actually want and need because you're too busy trying to play this role that's been set out for you. And while that could happen to anyone in any industry, I think it's become particularly institutionalized in our profession, and you see it show up in overperforming. Let's bring 10 options instead of 2 or 3. Mm-hmm. Let's perfect the visual instead of saying we only need the client to understand the concept and say right direction, wrong direction. So we overperformed. Lack of respect for schedules, demanding things to be done in too short of a time frame, keeping a schedule even when changes have been made or decisions are still pending, sacrificing fees, like I mentioned, sacrificing staff well-being to please a client. That's all stuff that we really have to change because it makes it harder for people to want to be in the profession. It creates lack-based thinking. It also really hurts our ability to make a difference. Again, going back to if you're an architect, there's a reason you wanted to do this. And we're here to make a difference. The world doesn't need any more mediocre buildings that are going to have a 10 to 15 year life and then get torn down. There's so many things that we all care about that the built environment can impact. And when we don't act as advocates, when we don't help our clients to see how certain decisions can impact things they care about, how it's not just about first cost, but about long-term value. When we don't connect those dots, we do everyone a disservice because the work we're producing isn't what it could or should be, but it's also making us feel exhausted and burned out and demoralized versus doing work that feels very purposeful. So that's really what I hope to be about. When I say change the world, I'm not some crazy idealist, just spinning dreams. It's true. And, changing the world might look like I did this in this project and this in that project. It may not be some dramatic thing, but it made a difference for the people who had to use that space, and that's what matters.
Well, architecture is unique, in my opinion, because it blends both the creative and technical scientific disciplines all together. It's kind of like marketing a little bit, where you do have, there is the creative side, but there's also some of the technical side. Well, this is a great kind of sample of what listeners can expect from your podcast, Architecting. Just to kind of get us back to that, Angela, I've got one more question for you before we end here. Where do you see the show going from here?
That's a good question. I still do want to do the weekly episodes. I've played with doing some workshops. So I aired an episode last year where I brought together the leaders of 2 mentorship programs for emerging professionals in architecture, and we did it like a workshop, and they were interviewed. Recently in the Cincinnati area, we had our NOMA chapter reform. We used to have one, and then it kind of faded away, and in helping celebrate that process with them over the past year, I got together the president, vice president, and secretary, and we had a conversation, and that was an episode that aired just a couple weeks ago. And so I kind of am liking this format of having multiple people expressing thoughts and that more workshop feel. So I may do a few more of those. I'm also very interested in doing more workshop activities. So I mentioned the Salutogenesis for the Soul, and I've done that as a mini retreat that was 4 hours. I've done it as an hour-long format, and I've also been invited a few times to do it for a Women in Architecture group that the AIA has, where it's been more of a 15 to 20 minute exercise. But I'd love to do some of those more as episodes and do more of those workshops where it's not about listening to a podcast, but it's more of a live event.
I've had some experience recording those panel conversations, and I've found that those conversations are very different than a one-on-one interview format or even a monologue format for a podcast. You get sort of this focus group think mentality, and there's an energy that comes out of people that are either agreeing on something or maybe there's a disagreement, which can lead to a productive conversation. Well, for folks that are listening to this and they want to connect with you and learn more about you and GBBN and listen to your podcast, where can they find you?
Sure. So I am at architectingpodcast.com. That is my website. And from there, you can learn about the 2 books I have. You can learn about the different classes I have. You can look at the podcast. I also have links there to another show that I do on Clubhouse, which is an app with my co-host Megan Mizzoko called Architects as Healers, Buildings as Medicine. So if you want to tap into more of that technical stuff, you can also reach me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect. And you can find me on Instagram at Architecting Podcast or on Facebook. I also have a Facebook page if anybody's still on Facebook that wants to connect to Architecting Podcast that way, you can absolutely do that. I'm on Twitter, IEX these days as well. I also have a YouTube channel for architecting, so you can find me there. And I'm also, if you go to the GBBN website, you can learn more about GBBN. It's gbbn.com. Simple and easy to find, and you can definitely reach out if you have ideas for projects or anything like that. We'd love to talk to you.
Excellent. Angela, thank you so much for your time today.
Absolutely. Thank you.